The train smelled like coal smoke and old leather and the particular loneliness of long distances. Emma Calloway had been riding it for 4 days, and by now she had memorized every crack in the ceiling of the passenger car, every knot in the wooden bench beneath her, every mile of flat Kansas grassland, giving way to the harder, drier country that stretched toward the Colorado border. She knew the woman 2 rows ahead who ate hard-boiled eggs at every meal. She knew the sound the wheels made when they slowed, a particular reluctant groan. And she knew the conductor's habit of humming off key when he thought no one was listening. What she did not know was what she was riding toward. She had the letter, of course. She had read it so many times the paper had softened at the folds. It was businesslike, formal. Mr. Holt Callahan of Callahan Ridge, Colorado Territory, was seeking a wife of good character and capable disposition. He had a daughter in need of feminine care. He was a man of some means. He preferred a woman of practical nature who did not expect sentiment. That last line had given Emma pause when she first read it in the agency's parlor in Wichita. It had given her pause again on the platform while her trunk was loaded. It gave her pause now with the letter folded in her coat pocket and the mountains finally appearing on the horizon like dark teeth against a white sky. A woman of practical nature who did not expect sentiment. She was 26 years old. She had buried her mother 2 winters ago and her father the following spring in the same churchyard in the same hard ground. She had sold the house to pay the debts they left behind, and she had taken work as a seamstress, and for a year she had been perfectly fine. Practical. Capable. Not expecting sentiment. Then the roof of her boarding house had caught fire and taken everything she owned except the dress she was wearing and the $23 in her apron pocket, and she had stood in the street at 3 in the morning watching the smoke rise and thought with a clarity that surprised her. This is enough. I need something different. The agency had cost her 18 of those dollars. The remaining 5 were in the same pocket as the letter. The train ticket had been paid by Mr. Callahan, forwarded through the agency, which meant that even if she wanted to turn back now, and she had considered it at least a dozen times most recently, in the long dark before this particular dawn, she couldn't afford to. So she was riding toward the mountains, and the man who didn't expect sentiment, and she was telling herself it was enough. People built good lives on less. Her grandmother had crossed an ocean to marry a man she'd never met, and they'd had 37 years together and 5 children and a farm that still stood in Pennsylvania. Sentiment was not the only foundation. The train slowed into Ridgemont Station at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Emma gathered her traveling bag and stepped down onto a platform that was nothing more than weathered boards and a hand-painted sign. The station behind it was a low building of rough-cut logs, and beyond that spread the town 2 main streets, a livery, a general store, a saloon with its doors flung open despite the cold. 3 or 4 buildings she couldn't identify from this distance. The mountains were enormous here. She hadn't expected that. In Kansas, the sky was everything, a full ceiling of light and cloud. Here the sky felt corralled, pushed back by peaks so large they seemed to tilt toward each other overhead. The air was thinner and sharper and smelled of pine and something mineral she couldn't name. She stood on the platform with her traveling bag and waited. The other passengers dispersed quickly. A family with 4 children was met by a man in a wagon. An older gentleman with a doctor's bag was greeted by a young man who took his luggage with evident relief. A woman in a green dress walked directly toward the saloon without looking left or right. Emma waited. After 15 minutes, she began to wonder if she'd gotten the date wrong. She pulled out the letter again and checked. October the 14th. She looked at the platform sign at the station, at the handful of horses tied along the main street. Then she heard boots on the boards behind her. Miss Calloway. The man who asked was not what she'd expected from the letter's brisk formality. He was perhaps 40, lean in the way of men who work in all weathers, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the mountains behind him. Dark hair gone silver at the temples. Eyes the color of a winter sky, not blue exactly, but not gray either. Something between the two, like the hour before full dark. He was holding his hat in both hands and not smiling. "Yes," she said. "I'm Emma Calloway." "Holt Callahan." He nodded once as if confirming a business transaction. "Your trunk come through." It did. The station master said it would be on the platform. "I'll get it." He walked past her without ceremony and spoke briefly to the station master, and Emma watched him heft her trunk onto his shoulder with the ease of a man accustomed to wait. He carried it to a wagon at the edge of the platform. A good wagon, she noticed, well maintained with a matched pair of roans. Whatever else Mr. Callahan was, he wasn't poor. He set the trunk in the wagon bed and came back. "Long ride," he said, looking at her traveling bag. "You need to eat before we head out. It's 2 hours to the ranch." "I ate on the train, thank you." Another nod. He gestured toward the wagon seat and she climbed up unassisted because he didn't offer a hand and she wasn't going to wait for one. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, and they were moving before she'd quite settled herself, and she had to grip the seatboard to keep from lurching sideways. They rode out of Ridgemont in silence. The road climbed almost immediately, winding up through pine forest, with the occasional break of meadow where the grass lay flat and silver under the October sky. Emma watched the land and tried to read it the way she'd once read the face of a new customer, what it wanted, what it was hiding, what it would give if you asked correctly. "Tell me about your daughter," she said. Holt Callahan's hands shifted on the reins. It was a small movement, barely visible, but she'd spent her whole life watching hands. "Sarah, she's 10. What's her illness?" A pause. "Doctors have different words for it. Her lungs. The cold makes it worse. She gets spells where she can't breathe right, and sometimes fever comes with it. She's been sick most of her life." His voice was flat. She couldn't tell if the flatness was grief or habit. "Her mother. Dead 3 years ago. I'm sorry." He didn't respond to that. After a moment, he said, "Sarah knows you're coming. She's been asking about you." "What did you tell her about me?" Another small pause. "That you were coming to help take care of her. Not that you were coming to be her mother. Not that you were coming to be my wife." Emma noted that. "And the wedding?" she asked. "Are there arrangements made in town?" "Judge Pierce does the ceremony. He's available whenever we're ready." "Whenever we're ready," as if it were a delivery to schedule. Emma looked out at the pine trees in the gray afternoon light and kept her voice even. "I'd like a day or two to settle in first, if that's agreeable." "Fine." She looked at him, then at the side of his face, the set of his jaw. He was watching the road. He was always going to be watching the road, she thought, looking ahead, looking forward, looking at the practical path from here to there. She had known men like this. Her father had been something like this after her mother got sick, as if grief had rearranged his face into something permanent and stern. She had learned to work around it. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Holt. Holt, I think we should be plain with each other." He glanced at her then. Just a glance, but she caught something in it, not quite surprise, but a calibration, as if he was reassessing a distance. "I'm listening," he said. "I know this isn't a love match. I understood that from the letter. I'm not here expecting romance. I'm here because I need a home and you need help with your daughter. I can give Sarah good care. I can manage a household. I can work hard. What I can't do is pretend we're something we're not, or act as if the arrangement is other than what it is." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Then I appreciate that. I'm not done." Another glance. Quicker this time. "I'll need to know the rules of your house, what you expect, what you won't tolerate. I don't like surprises, and I suspect you don't either. So if we're going to do this, let's do it with our eyes open." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more reluctant than that, the ghost of approval maybe from a man who didn't approve easily. "All right," he said. "Eyes open." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Measured rather than cold. Emma watched the mountains and thought about what she'd agreed to and decided it was workable. Not warm, not what she'd imagined at 14 or 16 or 20 when she still let herself imagine things, but workable. Callahan Ridge appeared first as smoke, three thin columns rising against the pine-dark ridgeline, and then as a cluster of buildings that resolved themselves gradually as the wagon crested a long rise, a main house of rough-hewn logs, 2 stories high, with a covered porch running its full length, a large barn painted the dark red of old blood. 3 smaller outbuildings, a bunkhouse with a slanted roof, and beyond all of it a network of fence lines stretching across a valley that was, despite the October cold, undeniably beautiful. The grass was still faintly gold where the frost hadn't taken it. The creek that ran along the valley's eastern edge caught the late light and turned copper. The mountains closed around the whole picture like a frame. "This is yours," Emma said. "My father built the main house. I've added to it." She could see where. The original structure was visible in the older, darker logs at the core, and the additions were newer cut wood in pale contrast. He'd built well. The additions were straight and solid, and the porch posts were plumb, and the whole thing sat on its foundation like it intended to stay there through anything the mountains could throw at it. Two ranch hands came out of the barn as they pulled up young men in worn coats, moving with the loose-limbed ease of the chronically outdoor. They took the horses without being asked, nodding to Holt, and looking at Emma with the flat-eyed courtesy of men who've been warned to be polite. "Ma'am," said the taller one. "Welcome to the Ridge," said the other. She thanked them and climbed down from the wagon, and that was when the front door opened and a child appeared on the porch. Sarah Callahan was small for 10. Emma had been prepared for that from the letter's description of her illness, but the reality of her was still striking. Not fragile exactly, but provisional, as if she existed at a slight remove from the solid world. She had her father's dark hair worn in two braids that someone had made an earnest but clumsy effort to plait evenly, and her father's same not-quite blue eyes. She was wearing a dress that was too large for her, a good wool dress that had probably been let out twice already, and she was holding the porch railing with both hands. She was looking at Emma with an expression of almost painful hope. Emma had seen that expression before. She'd worn it herself at various ages, waiting for various people to arrive and be what she needed them to be. It was the most heartbreaking expression a human face could make. She walked toward the porch without waiting for Holt and smiled up at Sarah. Not the careful, professional smile she'd developed for uncertain customers, but the real one, the one her mother used to say could charm birds out of trees. "You must be Sarah," she said. "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "Papa said you were coming from Kansas." "I did. It's flatter there. I've never seen mountains this close before." Sarah's eyes shifted briefly to the peaks above the ridge, as if checking to confirm they were still there. "They're different at different times," she said. "In the morning they're purple. At noon they're gray. When there's snow on them, they turn pink right before dark." "I'll have to watch for that. I could show you where to stand to see it best." "I'd like that very much." The hope in Sarah's face didn't disappear, but it shifted, became something steadier, something with less desperation in it. Emma climbed the porch steps and stopped in front of her, close enough to see the dark circles under her eyes, the slight work of her breathing. Not labored, not at rest either. Something in between, like a body accustomed to effort. "Hello, Sarah," she said more quietly. "Hello, Miss Calloway." "Emma, you can call me Emma." Behind her she heard Holt's boots on the steps. "Take Miss Calloway inside, show her the house," he said to his daughter. His voice was the same flat register as in the wagon, but she heard something under it, a thinness like cloth worn fine from handling. Sarah nodded and pushed open the front door, and Emma followed her inside. The house was clean. That was the first thing Emma registered, clean in the deliberate way of a place where someone works hard to compensate for something. The floors were swept, the dishes stacked, the curtains straight. But there were gaps in the cleaning corners of neglect that showed in the dust along the top of the mantel, the faint smell of stale air in the parlor, the absence of any small comforts. No flowers dried and hung, no pieced quilt on the settee, no small decorative objects that said, "A woman has thought about how this looks." It was a house maintained by a man and a child trying their best. You could see the effort. You could also see all the places the effort stopped. Sarah showed her the parlor with its stone fireplace, the kitchen with its cast-iron range, the small room beside it that served as a pantry and Holt's study combined. Then up the narrow stairs to the two bedrooms above. Her own bedroom, large, with a window facing the mountains, and at the end of the hall, Sarah's room, which was the most human room in the house, a child's drawings pinned to the wall, a collection of river stones arranged on the windowsill by size, a worn stuffed rabbit half hidden under the pillow. "That's Barnabas," Sarah said, following Emma's gaze. "Fine name for a rabbit. He was Mama's when she was little." A beat. "Papa thinks I'm too old for him now." "I think," Emma said carefully, "that you're exactly old enough to keep what matters." Sarah looked at her for a moment with that measuring look that children use when they're deciding whether to trust. Then she picked up Barnabas and set him on top of the pillow where he could be seen, and didn't say anything else about it. Dinner that evening was beans and cornbread and salt pork prepared by a ranch hand named Clarence, who did the cooking with competent indifference. Holt sat at the head of the table. Sarah sat to his right. Emma was given the chair across from Sarah, and she ate and asked questions about the ranch: how many cattle, how many hands, what the winters were usually like, and Holt answered in the measured way of a man who was finding this manageable. That was the impression he gave consistently, that he was managing. The house, the child, the dinner, and now this new variable at his table. He managed all of it with the same careful economy of expression, and Emma thought she could respect that, even if she couldn't warm to it. After dinner, Sarah helped clear the table and then climbed the stairs at Holt's direction, and Emma heard the creak of her footsteps above as she got ready for bed. Holt poured coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been drinking for the last year, and set a cup in front of her without asking. She wrapped both hands around it. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the wind had picked up, pressing against the window glass. "She likes you already," Holt said. "I like her." It was true. The girl was quick and observant and trying very hard to be brave about things no 10-year-old should have to be brave about. She's been... He stopped, started again. Since her mother, she's been quieter. She was always a reader, always a watcher, but there used to be more. He stopped again. He was looking at his coffee cup. She doesn't laugh as much. It cost him something to say that. Emma could hear the cost of it in the careful control he kept on his voice. "She'll laugh again," she said. He looked up. "You don't know that." "No, but I've seen children who've lost people find their way back to laughing. It takes time and it takes the right conditions, but they get there." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something like the edge of warmth, the possibility of it. "We should set the wedding for the end of the week," he said. "If you're agreeable." She was. They set it for Friday. Emma had been at Callahan Ridge for 3 days when she met Luke. She had heard about him. Holt had mentioned a younger brother who worked the ranch, and Clarence had referred to him twice in passing, and Sarah had said Uncle Luke with an inflection that contained more warmth than she gave almost anything else. So she had assembled a rough picture, younger, useful part of the household's working life. She was in the barn on that third morning learning the horses because she had decided early that the best way to make herself useful was to understand every moving part of the place she was about to call home. She had introduced herself to each horse in the systematic way her father had taught her, standing at the stall gate, first letting them come forward to smell her hand, then moving and slowly talking the whole time in a low, continuous murmur about nothing in particular. The gray mare had been third. She was a steady animal with a deep chest and a Roman nose, and the kind of patience that comes from years of reliable work, and she had blown a warm breath against Emma's palm and then allowed the brushing without fuss. She had her hand on the neck of a gray mare named Dust when she heard the barn door open behind her. The man who came in was not the man she'd been picturing. He was perhaps 35, 2 or 3 inches shorter than Holt, and built differently, broader through the shoulders, with a face that hadn't been trained into severity yet. Dark hair like his brother's, but worn longer, curling slightly at the collar. A mouth that looked like it defaulted to smiling. He was carrying a coiled rope over one shoulder and stopped when he saw her, and his face did exactly what she'd been told Holt's never did. It opened. "Well," he said, "you must be the woman from Kansas." "Emma Calloway," she said. "And you're the brother." He grinned at that, a quick, real grin, the kind that reaches the eyes. "Luke Callahan. I've been up at the North Pasture for a week, or I'd have met you before now." He set the rope on a hay bale and came toward her with his hand extended, and she shook it. His grip was firm and direct, no performance to it. "How are you finding it up here?" "Cold," she said honestly. "Beautiful. Complicated." Something in his expression acknowledged that last word with a kind of tired honesty. "Yeah," he said, "it is that." He checked on a horse in the far stall, a big chestnut with a cut on his front leg that Luke cleaned and rewrapped with practiced efficiency, and while he worked, he talked. Not the way Holt talked in careful, measured portions, but freely moving from one subject to another with the ease of a man comfortable in conversation. The chestnut's injury, the north pasture fencing that needed mending before the hard cold set in, the way the first real snowfall usually came sudden off the eastern ridge, a story about a summer storm 3 years back that had driven the whole cattle herd across the valley and halfway up the mountain. He made her laugh. Twice, actually, and the sound of it surprised her, both times the realness of it, the way it came from somewhere she hadn't accessed in a while. "Sarah talks about you," she offered when he'd finished rewrapping the chestnut's leg. He straightened and his expression shifted, not closed exactly, but more careful. "She's a good kid." "She is." "Has she—" He paused, brushing his hands on his work pants. "Has she shown you the place she found up by the east fence, the flat rock with the view?" Not yet. She will. He said it with certainty, with the warmth of someone who knows a child well enough to predict her. She takes everyone she likes up there eventually. Everyone she likes. Emma noted the implication without drawing attention to it. She went back to the house for breakfast and found Holt already at the table and Sarah coming downstairs in her coat and scarf, and the morning arranged itself around the ordinary rhythms of a household beginning its day. But she was aware in a way she hadn't quite been before of the shape of this family, the father who held everything at a controlled distance, the child who reached toward warmth like a plant toward light, and somewhere in the middle of it, doing the actual reaching back, Luke Callahan. She married Holt on a Friday morning in Judge Pierce's small office above the hardware store in Ridgemont. The office smelled of old paper and wood smoke and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco. A single window overlooked the main street, and through it Emma could hear the ordinary sounds of a Thursday, a wagon on the frozen mud, two men talking outside the livery, the distant hammer of someone doing repair work at the far end of the street. Life happening with perfect indifference to the event occurring above it. She found that steadying somehow, the world not stopping to mark the occasion, just going on in its reliable way. The judge was a stout, cheerful man with silver mutton chop whiskers who read the words with the practiced ease of someone who'd performed the ceremony many times. Sarah stood beside Emma in her good dress, the same wool one finally altered to fit, and held Emma's hand without being asked. Holt stood straight and said his words clearly, and placed a plain gold band on Emma's finger with the same precise economy with which he did everything else. Luke stood behind Holt. He had come in late, the last to arrive, and he was still in his work clothes, the closest thing to a suit he apparently owned, and his hair was damp from hasty washing. He caught Emma's eye once when the judge paused to find his page, and he gave her a very small nod. She couldn't quite decode what it meant. Acknowledgement, maybe, or solidarity. Afterward, there was no celebration. Holt shook the judge's hand and paid him, and they all went back to the wagon and rode home. Sarah fell asleep against Emma's arm on the way back, and Emma sat with the child's warm weight against her side, and her new husband's silence on her other side, and the ring on her finger was cool and strange and very real. That night after Sarah was in bed, Holt came to Emma's doorway. She was sitting at the window brushing her hair, watching the shapes of the mountains against the star-bright sky. "I'll sleep in the room at the end of the hall," he said. "I moved my things this afternoon." She hadn't asked about the sleeping arrangements, deliberately letting that particular practicality find its own resolution. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. He was looking at something past her shoulder, the window, the mountain, some middle distance. "Sarah's mother and I," he started, stopped. "We were different. What that was between us. I'm not—" Another stop. "I don't expect you to be her." "I know," Emma said. "I just meant Holt." She turned to look at him directly. "I know, we've been playing with each other. We'll keep being playing with each other. That's enough." He looked at her, then a full direct look, the first real one he'd given her. Something passed through his face that she might have called relief if she'd been able to believe he felt it. Then he nodded once and stepped back from the doorway and was gone, and she heard his footsteps down the hall. She turned back to the window. The mountains were silver under the stars. The ring on her finger caught the light. Workable, she told herself. This is workable. The days found their rhythm. Emma rose at 5:30 with the ranch and had coffee ready when Holt came through the kitchen, and he took it without comment, but without the rigid formality of those first days either. She spent her mornings with Sarah, lessons at the kitchen table. Sarah was sharp and impatient with arithmetic, but loved to read, and Emma brought out a dog-eared collection of stories she'd carried in her traveling bag and watched the girl's eyes go bright with a quality that was almost hunger. Afternoons she spent learning the house itself, its needs and gaps, the things that wanted doing. There was a great deal that wanted doing. Not because Holt had been careless, he hadn't, but because a household run by a man with no domestic inclination and a child with limited energy inevitably accumulates a particular kind of neglect. The kind that isn't squalor, but is rather an absence of the small things that make a place feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Emma found a broken window latch on the second day and fixed it. She found a basket of mending in the back of the linen closet that had apparently been waiting for years. Shirts with missing buttons, a quilt with a split seam. Sarah's stockings with holes that the girl had been hiding by pushing them down inside her boots. She mended it all in the evenings by lamplight, and the first night she laid out his repaired shirts on Holt's dresser, he stood in the doorway of his room for a moment and looked at them and said nothing. But she noticed the next morning that he was wearing one. Sarah improved in small, measurable ways from the beginning. Not her lungs, those were stubborn and followed their own timetable, but her spirit, her dailiness, her willingness to exist in the present, rather than the cautious near future she seemed to have learned to inhabit. She showed Emma the flat rock by the east fence on the fifth day, exactly as Luke had predicted, climbing the hill in her coat and scarf with Emma beside her. And at the top, she swept her arm out at the valley below and said, "That one's mine," the way children claim landscapes. "I see why," Emma said, and she did. They stayed up there for an hour sitting on the rock while Sarah told Emma the names she'd given to various visible features of the valley. The creek bend was the elbow. The far stand of aspen was the yellow wood. The rocky outcropping on the ridge above was the sentinel. She had a whole private geography of the place, a map of names no one else used, and sharing it was an act of significant trust that Emma received carefully. It reminded her, she realized, of the way her mother used to tell stories about Kansas. The same impulse to make a landscape your own by naming its particulars to turn geography into biography. Her mother had named the oak tree by the fence, Old Senator, in the particular rise in the road where you could first see the house coming back from town, she called the lookout, and you could see, listening to Sarah, that same human need to place yourself inside a landscape by giving it a personal language. The difference was that her mother had done it from a life of decades on the same land, and Sarah had done it in 10 years of being mostly confined to the valley below. Emma looked at the careful geography of names and thought about what it meant to love a place you couldn't freely move through, what it meant to own something in the mind that you could not always reach with the body. "Who taught you to name things like that?" Emma asked. "Uncle Luke, mostly." She picked up a pebble and turned it in her fingers. "He says every place deserves its own name. He says if you name something, you can't be afraid of it anymore." Emma looked out at the valley and thought about that. The idea that naming was a form of possession or of courage. "He's probably right," she said. "Papa doesn't name things," Sarah said. "Papa just calls them what they are. The creek, the ridge, the north pasture." A pause. "I think maybe Papa is afraid of more things than he says." 11 words from a 10-year-old, and they sat with Emma for the rest of the day. Luke fell into their days without any announcement or ceremony. He came in for meals when he was working close enough, and he appeared in the barn and the yard and the far reaches of the fence lines, always working, always in motion, but with a different quality of motion than Holt's, where Holt moved with purpose, with the steady forward direction of a man who knows exactly where each action leads. Luke moved with a certain generosity toward detour. He would stop to watch a hawk overhead, or crouch down to examine a stone Sarah showed him, or lean against a fence post and listen when one of the younger ranch hands wanted to talk through a problem. He didn't try to make Emma comfortable. He was simply comfortable himself, and it turned out that was the same thing. She found herself without quite intending to telling him things. Not important things, not at first. The seamstress work in Wichita, the difficulty of fitting a coat to a woman who wouldn't stand still. The particular smell of her mother's kitchen before the sickness changed it. The way she'd gotten her mother's practical nature and her father's stubbornness and spent most of her life trying to negotiate between the two. He listened with his full attention, which was rarer than it seemed. He didn't wait for his turn to talk. He absorbed what she said and responded to it, and when he had things to say in return, they were connected to what she'd actually said rather than launched from some private starting point. She was careful. She was married, and she was not a fool, and she could feel the difference between the warmth she was supposed to feel for the man she'd married and the warmth she actually felt in the company of his brother. She was careful to honor the line between them, to keep their time together incidental and functional and properly chaperoned by the ordinary business of the ranch. But she noticed things. She noticed that he checked on Sarah with the ease of someone who's been doing it for years, not the careful, formal attention of an uncle, fulfilling a duty, but the quick, familiar attentiveness of someone who loves a child and knows her. She noticed that when there was difficult work, fence posts and frozen ground moving cattle through a narrow gap, anything that required strength and persistence, he did it without complaint and without theater. She noticed that when Holt was short with the hands, and he was occasionally with the flatness of his authority becoming something harder, Luke had a way of smoothing it, a deflecting word, or a redirected task that eased the tension without calling attention to itself. He was, she thought, the connective tissue of this place, the thing that kept it from going rigid. One afternoon, she was in the kitchen garden. She had reclaimed it from weeks of neglect, raking the dead annuals and turning the soil for the spring planting. She was already planting when she heard voices from the side of the barn. She wasn't listening deliberately. They simply carried on the clear October air. Getting attached, Holt said. She's good with Sarah, Luke said. Let her be attached. A pause. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. Luke's voice had shifted, less easy, more careful. And I'm telling you, it's nothing to worry about. She has a role here. I need that role to be clear. To her or to you? Silence. Holt! Luke's voice was quiet now, private sounding, a voice for a conversation no one was meant to overhear. She came here in good faith. She's doing right by Sarah. She's doing right by all of it. The least you can do is let her exist here without... I know. Flat. Clipped. The end of the conversation. Emma went back to her raking and made a great deal of noise doing it. That evening, Holt came into the kitchen while she was washing up after dinner and stood at the counter beside her, which was not his habit. She kept washing and waited. You're doing well with Sarah, he said. I'm glad. More than I expected. A pause. More than I hired for. She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, not looking at her, but not looking away from her either. Looking at the same middle distance he favored. I don't do less than my best, she said. No, he said. I'm beginning to see that. He uncrossed his arms and stood straight, and for a moment he was simply a tall man in a clean kitchen, not managing anything, not maintaining distance, just standing there. Then he said more quietly, thank you, and left before she could answer. She stood with her hands in the wash water and thought about the conversation she'd overheard and the conversation she just had and the space between them. Captain. She was in the barn the morning she found Luke sitting on a hay bale in the back corner, not working, not moving. Just sitting with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, and the particular quality of stillness about him that meant he'd been sitting there for a while. She almost left. She hesitated in the doorway long enough that he heard her and turned his head. Sorry, he said. He stood reaching automatically for his rope and hat. Didn't realize I was blocking. You're not blocking anything. She came into the barn and led dust out of her stall to brush her. You looked like you were thinking. I was. He didn't say what about. He stood there for a moment, and she thought he was going to leave, but instead he sat back down on the hay bale and turned his hat in his hands. She worked the brush through dust's mane in slow strokes and waited. Do you know about Catherine? He asked eventually. She stopped brushing. Holt's wife. She died in an accident. He was looking at his hat. Wagon went off the south trail. The creek was up. We'd had a week of rain. It comes fast up here. And the bank gave. She was bringing supplies from town. A pause. I was supposed to make that run. I traded with her. I had something else I wanted to do that day. Something I can't even remember anymore. His voice was very steady, the steadiness of someone who has been over this ground so many times it's worn smooth. If I'd taken the run, I'd have been in that wagon. Emma set the brush down on the stall gate. Luke, Holt knows that. He's never said it, not once, not even in the beginning when he had every right to. But he knows it, and I know he knows it. He looked up at her finally. I've been living on this ranch for 3 years because I can't figure out how to leave, and he can't quite figure out how to make me go. And neither of us talks about it. He spread one hand. We just work. She thought about the quiet at Holt's dinner table, the flat voice, the managed distances, the way two men could share a life and carry a tragedy between them without ever setting it down to look at it directly. You didn't kill her, she said. I know that. Do you? He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, not the easy openness she was used to from him, but something deeper and more painful than that. Some days, he said. She picked up the brush again. You should tell him that, she said. Not the trading, not the accident, the guilt, that it's still there, that you still carry it. He doesn't want to hear it. Maybe not, but you need to say it, and you won't be free of it until you do. She stroked the brush through dust's mane again. That's not advice, by the way. That's just what I've seen with people who carry things. He was quiet for a moment. Then in a different voice, gentler and more direct, "You're easy to talk to, Emma." She kept her eyes on Dust's neck. "I'm a practical woman from Kansas," she said. "We're trained for it." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, and the tension in the barn shifted, and they went back to the work of the morning. But she was aware of something between them that hadn't been there before. Not the ease of their usual conversation, but something quieter and less comfortable. The particular charged air of a truth that's been shared and can't be unshared. The day shortened and the cold deepened, and the ranch pulled inward on itself in the way of places that know a hard winter is coming. The cattle were moved to the lower pastures. The wood was cut and stacked in quantities that seemed excessive until you saw the ridge after the first snowfall, when everything outside the barn doors became a white and featureless world, and the stacks began depleting with alarming speed. Emma had found her place in it. Not the place she'd imagined, not any of the versions of this life she'd entertained on the long train ride west, but a real place with real weight and real meaning. She managed the house with a competence that had slowly been recognized. Clarence deferred to her on kitchen questions. The younger hands learned her moods. Holt brought her problems and accepted her solutions. And Sarah had opened like a window thrown wide in spring, and the child who had met Emma on the porch with desperate hope had become by November a child who laughed at breakfast and argued about her lessons and fell asleep on Emma's shoulder during the long evenings by the fire. Sarah's lungs were not better. That was the immovable fact at the center of everything, the rock the current divided around. She had good days and bad days and occasional terrible days when her breathing became labored and her lips went pale, and Emma sat beside her bed through the night with her hand on the girl's back, feeling for the steady rhythm under her palm, terrified in the particular way of someone whose fear is more specific and more intimate than panic. It was an old fear, the kind that settles in, the kind that wakes you before dawn. On one of Sarah's bad days in late November, Holt came to stand in the doorway of his daughter's room in the small hours and found Emma there. He stood for a long moment looking at the tableau, the sleeping child, and the watching woman lamplight, making everything amber and still. Emma looked up. She saw the fear on his face, not the managed distance, not the deliberate flatness, but the actual fear stripped of everything he used to contain it. He looked in that unguarded moment like a man who has been afraid for years and is simply too tired to pretend otherwise. She left Sarah's side and went to the doorway and stood close enough to speak quietly. "She's breathing easier now. The worst is past." He let out a breath. It had been in him for a while. "She's going to be all right tonight," Emma said. "You don't know that." "I know tonight." She held his gaze. "Tonight she's going to be all right." He looked at his daughter for a long moment, at the slow rise and fall of her thin chest, and then he looked at Emma with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly, but something more raw and more complicated than that. The look of a man who has just been given something he desperately needed and isn't sure he deserves. "Go sleep," she said. "I'll stay." He went, and she went back to the chair by Sarah's bed and sat until the gray winter dawn came through the window, and the child's breathing stayed steady through all of it. December came in hard. The first real snowfall arrived overnight, and Emma woke to a white silence that was different from any quiet she'd known in Kansas. The mountains absorbed sound differently, and the snow absorbed more, and the whole ranch lay buried in a hush so complete it felt pressurized. She stood at her bedroom window in the early morning and watched the mountains turn pink, exactly as Sarah had promised. And the sight of it, that improbable rose light on white peaks above the sleeping white valley, was so unexpectedly beautiful it made her eyes sting. Sarah found her there. The girl appeared in her doorway in her nightgown and saw Emma at the window and came to stand beside her without a word, and they watched the pink fade to pearl together. "See," Sarah said. "I see," Emma said. They stood there until the light went fully to morning gray, and then they went down to make breakfast, and Sarah chattered about the snow and the horses in the barn, and whether she thought it would be deep enough to sled. And Emma listened and answered and felt the specific weight of contentment that comes from being needed and useful and present in a life that was not the one you planned, but was unmistakably yours. That afternoon, while Holt was out with the hands checking fencing before the next expected snowfall, Emma and Luke were in the kitchen repairing a section of stovepipe that had come loose. It was a practical task requiring 2 pairs of hands and nothing more, and they worked in their usual comfortable efficiency, and Emma was reaching up to hold a section in place, while Luke set the join in the exertion of holding her arms overhead while trying to be precise, pulled a small laugh from her at the awkwardness of it. And Luke laughed too, the real laugh she'd learned to watch for, and in the same moment the pipe settled into place and they both lowered their arms and found themselves unexpectedly close in the narrow space beside the stove. She stepped back immediately. He cleared his throat and picked up the wrench. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. They finished the job and she went to start supper and he went back to the barn and the ordinary life of the household absorbed the moment and carried it forward with everything else. But that night, lying in the dark, with the mountains outside and the cold pressing at the glass, Emma lay very still and was honest with herself. She was a practical woman. She had come here with her eyes open. She had agreed to a life that was clear and bounded and real. She was good at it. She was building something here with Sarah, with this household, with the careful, workable arrangement of her marriage. And somewhere between the barn and the kitchen table and the flat rock by the east fence, she had begun to love a man she wasn't married to. Not a wild or dramatic love. Not the kind she might have imagined at 16, but the kind that grows without announcing itself from small things. The way he listened, the way he worked, the way he talked to Sarah, the way he told her his worst truth sitting on a hay bale in the corner of the barn, the way he laughed, the way he moved through the world as if the world was worth moving through. She lay in the dark and was honest about it, and then she made a decision. She was going to bury it. She was going to fold it down very small and put it somewhere it couldn't cause harm, and she was going to go on being a practical woman from Kansas and a good wife and an excellent mother to a girl who needed her. She made this decision with complete sincerity. She had no intention of doing anything else. She just had not accounted for the February afternoon when everything shifted. It was a Thursday, the kind of winter afternoon that looks deceptively calm from inside the house. Pale skylight wined the mountains stark and clear. Emma was mending in the parlor, Sarah asleep upstairs, after a rough night with her lungs, when she realized she'd run out of the brown thread she needed. She went to the outbuilding where the extra supplies were stored. It was a short walk across the yard, hardly worth her coat, but she pulled it on anyway and crossed the packed snow and found the thread and was coming back when the sky changed. It happened fast, the way Luke had warned her it could. The pale sky went the color of iron while she was still 20 yards from the house, and then the wind came, not the light wind of the afternoon, but something with body and intention cold enough to burn her face in the first second of contact. She pulled her coat tighter and quickened her pace and made it to the porch just as the first pellets of ice came sideways. Luke was coming from the barn at a half-run, already heading for the house, and they arrived at the porch steps at the same moment and ducked under the overhang together as the ice became sleet, became a hard wall of sound. The porch was sheltered, but only just the wind found angles around the posts, and the overhang's edge was no protection against the blowing sleet. They stood pressed back against the house wall, shoulders nearly touching, watching the yard disappear into white. "That came fast," Emma said. "They always do off the East Ridge." Luke was scanning the yard, the distant shapes of the outbuildings. "The horses are in. The hands made it to the bunkhouse 20 minutes ago. I sent them." "Holt came in an hour ago." He glanced at her. "He's checking on Sarah." They stood in the narrow shelter of the porch while the storm worked itself out against the world, and the cold pressed in regardless of the overhang, and she could feel the warmth of him standing close in the way you feel the sun without looking at it, as a presence, a fact, a comfort too immediate to dismiss. She looked at the white fury of the yard and talked herself through the practical inventory of the ranch horses in hand safe fire, burning Sarah asleep inside. She was perfectly sensible. She was perfectly controlled. She had been perfectly sensible and controlled for weeks, and she intended to stay that way. The wind shifted and drove a spit of icy air between the porch posts, and she flinched slightly involuntarily, and he shifted slightly toward her automatically, the reflex of a person responding to cold without thought. Neither of them acknowledged it. Both of them knew it had happened. She shouldn't have turned to look at him. She knew it in the same moment she did it. She turned and found him already looking at her with an expression she'd been carefully not seeing for weeks. Not the openness she'd cataloged and learned to navigate, but something more still and more honest than that. Something he had also been keeping folded small in a pocket somewhere, and it had fallen out now in the cold, in the noise of the storm, in the closeness. The world contracted to the porch, in the two of them, in the sound of the wind. She looked at his face. She thought, "Don't." And then the front door opened and Holt was there, and they both stepped apart. There had been nothing to step apart from. Nothing had happened. There was no distance to create that hadn't already existed. But the space between them felt different now, felt measured in a way it hadn't been before. Emma, Holt said, and then seeing Luke, "Storm caught you both." "Just coming in from the barn," Luke said. His voice was easy, unreadable. "Sarah's asking for you," Holt said to Emma. She went inside. She went up the stairs to Sarah's room and sat beside the girl and held her hand and listened to her talk about the storm and whether she'd be able to see fresh snow on the mountains in the morning. And she answered steadily and kept her voice warm. But her heart was hammering. Not with guilt, not yet, but with the particular terror of something that has named itself. Downstairs, she could hear the low exchange of the brothers' voices, too quiet to distinguish words. After a time, she heard the back door, and then nothing. And she knew Luke had gone to the bunkhouse to ride out the storm with the hands, and she felt the absence of his presence in the house like a change in pressure. She stayed with Sarah until the girl slept. Then she went to her room and sat at the window and looked at the storm and thought about what she'd almost done and what she would do now and what it was going to cost her to do it. She was careful after that, very careful. She found reasons to be in different places from Luke. She arranged her days so that the moments of close proximity, the natural overlaps of a working ranch, the kitchen, the barn, the yard between buildings, were reduced to the essential and the functional. She was polite and direct and warm in the way she was warm with Clarence and the other hands, and she watched him absorb this new distance without comment, and something in the set of his shoulders told her he understood it and was doing the same in his own way. This was the right thing. She knew it was the right thing. She went to sleep telling herself it was the right thing and woke up telling herself the same, and by the second week of January, she almost believed it. What she had not counted on was Sarah. Sarah who noticed everything. Sarah who had her father's eyes and her uncle's capacity for attention, and who had spent years watching the adults around her with the focused vigilance of someone who knows that the grown-up world is where the real information lives. It was a Sunday afternoon, the particular slow Sunday of deep winter, when the light through the windows was white and sourceless, and the whole ranch had a suspended quality as if time was taking the day off. Holt was reading. Luke was in the barn with a horse that had been limping. Emma was with Sarah at the kitchen table playing a card game they'd invented together over the course of the winter, a complicated hybrid of rules that Sarah was explaining to Emma as if Emma hadn't helped invent them. Emma was distracted. She was thinking about the hem on a skirt that needed work, about the letter she owed to the woman in Wichita who'd been her closest friend before the fire, about the distant sound of wind at the eaves that meant the weather might shift. She was not thinking about Luke. "Emma," Sarah said. She looked up. Sarah was regarding her with an expression Emma had never seen on her face before. A look of careful, uncertain courage, the look of someone about to ask a question they're afraid to ask. "Can I say something? Always. And you won't be upset?" Emma set down her cards. "I'll try." Sarah looked at her hands on the table, shifted a card. "Sometimes when Uncle Luke isn't here, you look—" She paused, choosing. "You look like when you were looking for something and then remembered you left it at home." Emma said nothing. "And when Uncle Luke is here, you don't look at him the way you look at Papa." Another pause. "You look at him different." The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. "Sarah," Emma began. "I'm not angry," Sarah said quickly. "I'm not saying it bad. I just—" She looked up and her eyes were serious and much older than 10. "Uncle Luke looks the same way. When he thinks nobody's watching." Emma sat with that. She let it sit. She could feel the shape of the conversation she was supposed to have, the reassurances, the careful calibrations of truth and non-truth that adults give children to protect them from complexity they're not yet equipped to hold. But Sarah was equipped to hold a great deal. Emma had learned that. "Sometimes people feel things they shouldn't feel," she said finally. "Feelings don't ask permission. But what you do about them, that's where you have a choice." Sarah considered this. "So you're choosing not to?" "Yes. Because of Papa. Because of all of it. Because this is our home and our family and all the people in it matter. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set something down." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then very quietly, "Does it hurt?" Emma looked at her. At this girl who had learned too young the arithmetic of loss, who knew better than most what it cost to set things down. "Yes," she said honestly. "It does." Sarah nodded, as if this confirmed something she already understood. Then she picked up her cards again and said, It's your turn." And Emma picked hers up and played, and the Sunday afternoon arranged itself around the soft sounds of the card game and the ticking stove and the winter wind outside, and nothing else was said about it. But Emma went to bed that night with Sarah's words settled in her like a stone in still water. Uncle Luke looks the same way when he thinks nobody's watching. Bonsoir. February deepened. The snow that had been general and ordinary became something with more intention, repeated storms stacking on top of each other so that by the middle of the month, the valley lay under a depth of white that made the fence lines invisible and turned the walk to the barn into a project requiring judgment about footing. Holt was home more. The ranch work contracted in hard winter, less movement, more maintenance, the essential indoor tasks of keeping things running against the cold. He was in the house in the evenings, and Emma found herself observing him differently now, with the clarity that comes from having named something and decided not to act on it. He was a good man. She had always known that, but she could see it with more precision now, the specific ways he was good and the specific costs of the ways he kept people at arm's length. He had begun to look at her differently. She noticed it first in small ways. He refilled her coffee cup without being asked. He asked for her opinion on decisions that he would previously have made alone. He lingered in the evenings rather than retiring to his study the moment dinner was cleared. He was not being romantic. She didn't think romantic was a mode he had easy access to, but he was being present in a way he hadn't been before, as if he was practicing something. One evening he sat across from her by the fire while Sarah slept upstairs, and he said, "Tell me about Kansas." She looked up from her mending. "What about it?" "What it was like before you came here." She told him. The flat land and the flat sky, and the way the wind in summer was so constant, it became a kind of silence. The house she'd grown up in, the particular smell of her parents' kitchen in autumn. The boarding house, the seamstress, worked the fire. She talked for longer than she'd intended, and he listened with the focused attention he gave to the practical problems of the ranch, and she thought he is trying. Whatever he could not feel easily, he was trying to extend toward it. "You didn't have to come here," he said when she'd finished. "I know. I mean," he shifted in his chair. "I know the agency framed it as a necessity, the financial situation, but you could have found another way. You're—" a pause. "You're capable of finding another way." "I wanted to come west," she said. It was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. "Why?" She thought about it. "Because I wanted a life that was larger than the one I could see from there." She looked at the fire. "I didn't know what larger would look like." "Does it look like this?" She met his eyes. "It looks like Sarah falling asleep at the table because she stayed up to finish her chapter. It looks like those mountains in the morning. It looks like—" She stopped, continued. "Yes, it looks like this." He nodded slowly. Something settled in his face. Not happiness exactly, but the adjacent thing. The quieter, more durable thing that isn't happiness, but can sustain a person through what happiness cannot. She thought he was going to say something else, something that had been building in him through the winter that she could see in his eyes. But instead, he said goodnight and banked the fire and went upstairs, and she sat alone in the warm room with the mending in her lap and felt the complexity of everything she'd agreed to. March came in with a sudden ferocity that suggested the winter wasn't done with them yet. It was a Tuesday morning when Emma woke to a sky the color of pewter, and a stillness that felt wrong, the held breath stillness before something breaks rather than the ordinary quiet of a cold morning. She dressed quickly and went downstairs and found Clarence at the kitchen window. "Coming from the north," he said without turning. "Big one." By 10 o'clock, the snow had started in earnest. By noon, the visibility was down to 20 yards and falling. Holt had brought the hands in and secured the livestock, and they were all gathered in the main house. Holt, Emma, Sarah, Clarence, and two of the younger hands, Pete and Russ, with the bunkhouse, unreachable through what had become a genuine blizzard. Luke was not there. He had ridden north that morning before anyone saw the sky, checking on a section of fence that the last storm had reportedly damaged. He knew the terrain. He knew the weather signs. But Emma stood at the window and watched the white nothing beyond the glass and felt the cold settle into her chest in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Holt knew it too. She could see it in him in the way he came to the window periodically and looked north and said nothing. "He knows this country," Pete offered once. Holt didn't respond. Sarah had been sleeping when the storm hit, and she woke to the sound of the wind and came downstairs in her nightgown, and found the gathering in the kitchen and understood immediately children who've grown up on ranches understand storms with a body-level comprehension that others have to learn, and she came to stand beside Emma and took her hand without explanation. Then mid-afternoon, Sarah's breathing changed. It was the change Emma had learned to read like a language. The slight quickening, the shallow quality, the way her small body worked a little harder for each breath. The cold air, the stress of the storm, the confined house, any or all of them could trigger it. Emma guided her to the settee and got her upright, propped with pillows the way the doctor had shown her, and fetched the preparation the Ridgemont physician had left for exactly this situation. But this time it was worse than usual. Sarah was pale. Not the pale of being cold, the gray-white pale of not enough oxygen, and her lips had the bluish tint that Emma had been told to watch for, and her hands were shaking when Emma took them. "Papa," Sarah said, small, frightened, the voice of a child who is trying not to be terrified and is not quite succeeding. Holt was there before Emma finished the thought. He dropped to his knees in front of the settee and took his daughter's hands, and Emma had never seen his face so stripped of its managed distance. He was simply terrified, fully and openly, in a way he apparently couldn't help. "I'm here," he said. "I'm right here." "The medicine is helping," Emma said, her voice steady. "She needs to stay upright and stay calm." "I'm calm," Sarah said, not calmly. "You're doing well," Emma said. "You're doing everything right." She worked through the next hour with the focused efficiency of someone whose fear has been converted to purpose. Warm compresses on Sarah's chest. The steam treatment the doctor had demonstrated. Keeping the child talking, keeping her awake, keeping her mind engaged, and away from the edge of panic that would only make the breathing worse. Holt never left the room. He sat beside his daughter and held her hand and talked to her. And this was a Holt she hadn't seen a version of him before the wife's death. And the years of managed distance had accumulated a man who told his daughter stories in a low, unguarded voice. Childhood memories from his own years on this ranch. Funny things the horses had done the summer when the creek flooded and the barn sat 3 feet in water and the chickens moved into the parlor for a week. Sarah listened, her breathing steadied by degrees. Not quickly, not for another 2 hours, but steadily the way a fire settles when the worst of the wood is caught. Outside, the blizzard hammered the walls and the windows and found no way in. Emma left father and daughter briefly slipping into the kitchen to make broth and found herself leaning against the counter with her eyes closed for a moment. Just a moment, letting herself feel the full weight of what had just been required, and then folding it back down. The back door opened. She spun around. Luke stood in the doorway in a coat so caked with snow and ice, he looked like something the storm had made. His hat was gone. His eyebrows and lashes were white with frost. He was breathing hard, the breathing of exertion pushed to its limit, and when he saw her face, he stopped completely. "Sarah," he said. "She's stable," Emma said immediately. "She's with Holt. She's going to be all right." He closed his eyes briefly. His head dropped an inch. The relief moved through him visibly in his shoulders, in his hands, in the way he let out a breath that turned to mist in the cold air of the doorway. "Come in," Emma said. "Come in and close the door." He came in. She helped him with the coat. It weighed nearly double from the ice in it, and got him to the fire and brought him coffee and watched the color come back into his face. His hands shook slightly around the cup from cold rather than fear. "I got turned around in the north pasture," he said. "Had to wait it out in the old line shack. I didn't know it had reached the ranch. It came fast." "Emma." He looked at her across the coffee cup. "Is she really all right?" "She really is." She sat down across from him. "She's going to be very tired tomorrow and we'll need to watch her through the night, but she's past the worst of it." He nodded. He looked at the fire. Some expression moved through his face that she couldn't read. Too complicated, too many things at once. "You should know," he said, "that I've been thinking about leaving." The words landed in the room with the specific weight of things that have been carried for a long time. "Leaving the ranch," she said. "Yes." He turned the cup in his hands. "I've been offered work in New Mexico. Good work, honest work. I could go in the spring." She was quiet. "It would be better," he said. "For everyone." "Would it?" Not a question. "Emma." His voice was very low. "You know why I'm saying this." She did. She knew exactly why. She had been saying it to herself for months, not in those words, but in the logic of every careful step she'd taken to keep herself where she belonged. "Leaving doesn't fix it," she said. "It simplifies it." "For whom?" He didn't answer. Sarah loves you, she said. This ranch needs you. And running away from a feeling doesn't make it not exist. It just means you carry it somewhere else. She stood up. Don't make any decisions tonight. The storm hasn't even passed. She went back to Sarah and Holt in the long watch of the night, and she did not let herself think about the kitchen and the fire and the look on his face. The storm broke at dawn. The world outside was new and absolute in its whiteness. The valley so deeply buried that the first light turned it to a flat plain of light from which the mountains rose like they'd been placed there overnight. Sarah had slept through the last hours and woke flushed and exhausted, but breathing freely. Holt had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, his head tilted forward in the unmistakable way of a man who has lost consciousness accidentally. Emma covered him with a blanket without waking him. She went downstairs to find Luke already in the kitchen stirring a pot of something that smelled like the salt pork from yesterday's supper. You cook, she said, genuinely surprised. Badly, he said, but adequately. She took the spoon from him without ceremony, and he sat at the table and they were quiet together in the way of two people who have said something important and are letting it settle. I'm not going to go, he said after a while. She kept her eyes on the pot. Not because you told me not to, he added. Because you were right. Running doesn't... He stopped. I've spent 3 years trying to atone for something by staying. I can't atone for it by leaving either. I just have to... He made a motion with his hand. Be here, do the work. Let it be what it is. That's right, she said quietly. And what it is, he said very carefully, is that I respect you, and I respect Holt, and I respect Sarah, and I'm not going to... He stopped again. I'm not going to make this harder for anyone. She set the spoon down. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her steadily, openly, with the expression she'd learned to know and had spent months trying not to name. I know, she said. Good, he said. They looked at each other for a long moment across the kitchen, across everything that could not be said or done, and the morning came through the windows and the pot bubbled on the stove, and outside the buried valley shone in the first light. Then Holt came downstairs and she turned back to the stove and Luke got up to pour coffee and the day began. That evening, Holt found her on the porch. She was standing looking at the last of the winter light on the mountains wrapped in her coat, and she heard him come out and felt him stand beside her. He didn't speak immediately. They both watched the peaks for a while, the pink fading to gray. I heard what you said to Luke, he said, last night in the kitchen. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the mountains. His jaw was set with a particular tension she associated with him trying to say something he didn't have easy words for. I wasn't listening on purpose. I came down for water. I know, she said. Emma. He turned to face her and she saw for the second time in 2 days something stripped of its protection in his face. Not anger, not accusation, something more complicated and more painful than either. I think I've been... He stopped. Tried again. When I wrote that letter through the agency, what I told them I needed, a caretaker, a mother for Sarah, someone practical. His eyes held hers. I believed that. I told myself that was all I needed. But somewhere in the winter, he stopped. Holt, I started to feel something, he said plainly, for you. The porch was very still. I need you to know that, he said. Whatever else is true, whatever you feel or don't feel, I need you to know that. Because you came here in good faith, and I told you it would only ever be an arrangement, and I was wrong. She looked at him, at this man who had managed everything for 3 years and just admitted that he couldn't manage this. She felt the full weight of what she'd agreed to and what she'd found here and what she couldn't make herself feel, and she was honest about it because they had promised each other honesty. Holt, she said carefully, I think you're a good man. I think you're a far better man than you've let yourself be for a long time, and this winter I've seen that more and more. And I care about you. I do. He waited. But not in the way you deserve, she said. Not in the way a woman should care about the man she's married to. She held his gaze. I'm sorry. I came here meaning to do this right, and I tried. I am still trying, but there are things I can't make true by trying, and I think... Her voice stayed steady. I think you already know that. He was quiet for a long time. The peaks turned from gray to the deep blue-gray of early dark. A star appeared. "Luke," he said, not a question. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It's not going to. Emma." His voice was flat, the old flatness, but she could hear what was underneath it now, the specific pain of someone whose suspicion has been confirmed. "Don't tell me it doesn't matter. Tell me the truth." The truth. She had promised him that. "Yes," she said. He turned back to the mountains. His hands were flat on the porch railing, pressing down. He was very still. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said. "Neither has he. We both—" She stopped, started again. "I told you what I could offer. I meant it. I mean it still. I can be here. I can take care of Sarah. I can be a partner to you in every practical sense. I can—" "We stop," he said. She stopped. "I need to—" He pushed off the railing. "I need some time." He went inside and she heard his footsteps through the house, and then the back door, and then the sound of him walking away across the snow. She stood on the porch in the cold and watched the stars appear one by one over the mountains and held herself together with the pure force of discipline. Nim. The days that followed were the hardest of her time at Callahan Ridge. Holt came back that night late, and the next morning he was at breakfast, and he spoke to her in the same flat register, and he spoke to Luke the same way, and there was nothing specific to point to, no accusation, no scene, but the house had a new quality to it. A tightness, a held breath. Sarah felt it. Of course Sarah felt it. The girl moved through the house carefully, the way you move through a space where something fragile has been placed, and she was quieter at meals and came to Emma more often in the evenings, pressing against her side on the settee while they read. One evening, Emma came downstairs to find Holt and Luke standing in the kitchen. They were both very still, the still of men who have just stopped saying something, and the air between them had a particular charge that was almost visible. "I'm sorry," Emma said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," Luke said. "Emma." Holt's voice was careful. "Could you give us a few minutes?" She went back upstairs. She sat in her room and listened to the low rumble of their voices through the floor, and couldn't make out words, and eventually heard Holt go out the back door, and then nothing. Luke knocked on her door 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway. He didn't come in. "He needed to say some things," he said. "I know. We needed to say some things." His face was tired. Not the easy tired of hard work, but the older tired of long-held things finally set down. "It's been a while coming." "What happened?" He leaned against his doorframe. "He told me about Catherine, what he's blamed me for." A pause. "And I told him I've blamed myself for the same things for 3 years, and that maybe it was time we stopped blaming anyone." Another pause. It's not fixed. It doesn't fix in an evening. But he said it and I said it, and it's out of the ground now where we can see it." Emma looked at him. "That's something." "Yeah." He looked at his boots. "Emma, he's going to be—" He stopped, started again. "He's hurting. You know that. But he's going to be all right. He's tougher than he knows." "I know. I'm going to give him more room," Luke said quietly. "He needs it." "So do I," she said. He met her eyes. Something moved through his expression. Acknowledgement, pain, the careful restraint of someone choosing what to leave unsaid. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He pushed off the doorframe. "Good night, Emma." "Good night." She listened to his footsteps down the hall, and then there was nothing but the sound of the winter wind in the house settling around its old logs, and she sat in her room for a long time, not reading, not sleeping, just sitting in the honest quiet of everything that was and wasn't. April came slowly the way it does in high country. Not a door opening, but a seam widening, the snow retreating by inches up the south-facing slopes while the north-facing still lay buried and the morning stayed hard with cold. Sarah got better. It was gradual. The good days began to outnumber the bad, and the bad days weren't as bad, and by the middle of April, she was going out of the house, in her coat for longer stretches, following Emma to the kitchen garden, where the first frost-bitten shoots were attempting to push through the turned earth. She had color in her face. She was arguing more, which the doctor in Ridgemont said was an excellent sign. One afternoon, Emma looked out the kitchen window and saw Sarah in the yard running. Not fast, not for long, but running, her braids flying, chasing after a gray cat that had appeared from somewhere around the barn and shown no interest in being caught. running with the unconsidered ease of a child who is not thinking about her lungs, not thinking about her breathing, just running because there is a cat, and it is April, and the world has color in it again. Emma stood at the window with her hands flat on the counter and let herself feel all of it. The relief, the gratitude, the specific and enormous joy of a child's ordinary health. She felt the tears on her face and didn't try to stop them. "She's better," said Holt's voice behind her. She turned. He was in the kitchen doorway watching his daughter through the window, and his face, his managed, careful, perpetually controlled face, was open in the same way it had been in Sarah's sick room, those long, dark nights, stripped to its essential grief and love, and something else that was now, she realized, the beginning of peace. "She's better," Emma confirmed. He came to stand beside her at the window. They watched Sarah fail to catch the cat, and fail again, and then succeed and hold it up in obvious triumph. "She hasn't run like that since before winter," he said. "She's going to be all right, Holt." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said, and this time it wasn't an argument. It was an acknowledgement, the beginning of belief. They stood at the window together and watched Sarah negotiate with the cat, which was unimpressed. And despite everything, despite all the hard truths of the winter, despite all the things between them that were irreparable, she felt a specific, uncomplicated affection for this man that she thought was real and true and its own kind of love. Not the love she'd promised him, but not nothing. "Holt," she said, "whatever happens between us—" "Emma," he said it quietly. "I know." A pause. "We'll find our way. For Sarah's sake and because—" He stopped. The line of his jaw moved. "Because I think you're the best thing that's happened to this house in a long time, in whatever form that takes. I don't want to lose it." She looked at him. "You won't." He nodded once, the old nod, but it was different now. Softer. And he went back to the study and she went back to the stove, and outside Sarah finally let the cat go, and it trotted away unmoved, and Sarah stood in the mud and snow yard with her arms wide and her face up to the pale April sky. May came in with warmth and intention. The creek came up with snowmelt and ran loud and fast along the valley's edge, and the aspens put out their first tentative leaves, and the mountain grass showed in patches where the snow had fully retreated. Emma found Luke fixing fence along the east side of the home pasture on a Thursday afternoon. He was alone, working methodically, and he didn't hear her coming until she was nearly beside him. He looked up. Something moved through his face, the quick look of a man recalibrating a distance he's been maintaining carefully. "Emma, I came to help," she said. "I can hold the wire while you set the post. You don't have to." "I know." She picked up her end of the wire. They worked for an hour in the May afternoon in the particular easy silence of shared labor. The aspens made their spring sound a high, papery rustling, and the creek sang in the middle distance, and the mountains had lost their white and stood green-gray and enormous against the blue sky. "You're staying," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He set a post and packed dirt around the base. "Holt asked me to, not in so many words. But he asked." "Good. It'll be different," he said. "Yes. But maybe—" He paused, looking at the fence line ahead. "Maybe different is what we all needed." She thought about that, about the winter and everything it had stripped down and rearranged, about Sarah running after the cat in the April mud, about Holt standing at the kitchen window, about what she'd agreed to and what she'd found and what she'd set down and what she'd kept. "Luke," she said. He looked at her. "I'm going to be honest with you. I expect nothing less. I don't know what comes next. I don't know how any of this resolves. I don't know if—" She stopped, started again. "I don't know if it can be what I—" She stopped again, took a breath. "But I know that right now, today, I'm exactly where I should be. With Sarah, with this place, and you're part of this place, and I'm glad." He held her gaze. Something in his expression was quiet and very real. "I'm glad too," he said. They went back to the fence. Summer came to Callahan Ridge like a gift after a hard year. The kind of summer that a mountain ranch can produce, not generous exactly, but vivid. The sky, a particular deep blue, the pastures full with grass, the cattle fat and calm on the lower slopes. The creek shrank to its summer level, and the aspens went from pale spring green to the richer green of July, and Sarah spent her days in a range of activity that made the doctor in Ridgemont on his June visit look up from his examination with an expression of genuine surprise. "Whatever you're doing," he told Emma, "keep doing it." What she was doing, she thought, was exactly what she'd told Sarah in the kitchen on that February Sunday, being present, doing the work, tending what needed tending. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the stuff of the stories she'd loved as a girl. No dramatic declarations, no sudden revelations, no single moment where everything resolved. It was the small daily accretion of care. The mended things and the cooked meals and the lessons and the flat rock by the east fence and the stories at bedtime and the long evenings with lamplight. It was its own kind of love, and she found as the summer went on that she had stopped measuring it against a different kind. Holt changed. It happened so gradually that she couldn't have pointed to the moment it began, only to a point in July when she looked at him across the dinner table and thought, "This is a different man than the one who met me at the station." Not a transformed man. He was still careful, still measured, still the kind of person who expressed feeling through action rather than declaration. But the distance had receded. Not disappeared, it might never fully disappear. It was too much a part of him, but pulled back enough that she could reach him. She saw the change most clearly in the small things. He had started leaving his study door open in the evenings, rather than pulling it shut, and she could hear him in there sometimes, turning pages or writing, and the mere openness of the door was its own kind of communication. He had started talking to Sarah at dinner rather than simply directing her, asking her what she'd read that day, what she'd seen out the window, what she thought about a thing. And Sarah, responding to this, had become a different dinner companion herself, more animated, more willing to have opinions out loud, as if the frequency of being asked had convinced her that her opinions were worth having. He began to talk to her in the evenings, not just about the ranch, not just about Sarah's health, but about the things he turned over in the solitude of his days. His father, who had built this ranch out of nothing and expected his sons to be as hard as the country that made him. Catherine, whom he talked about gradually, carefully, as if testing the ground with each step. Not the idealized dead wife of his 3 years of silence, but a real woman, difficult and funny and stubborn, who had loved this place and sometimes resented it and never stopped arguing with Holt about whether he needed to be as serious as he made himself. One night he showed Emma a photograph. Two young people, himself at perhaps 30 before the stern lines had set, laughing at something off to the left of the frame, and a dark-eyed woman laughing beside him, her hand on his arm. "She looks wonderful," Emma said. "She was. I can see why you loved her." He looked at the photograph for a moment. "I did," he said. "Badly sometimes, better other times, but I did." He set it down. "I've been carrying her like a failure. Like I failed her by not—" He stopped. "Luke and I have been talking. He's helped me see some things." Emma looked at him. "When did you two start talking?" The ghost of a smile. "March, April. He told me about New Mexico, what he was thinking. I told him he was an idiot." A pause. "Then we talked about Catherine and some other things." "I'm glad," she said simply. "So am I." He looked at her directly. "Emma, I want you to know that I understand what I asked of you and what you agreed to and the ways it wasn't." He paused. "The ways it was less than you deserve. I want you to know that. We both walked into it," she said. "We both did our best." "I want to keep doing my best," he said. "Whatever that looks like. For Sarah. For you. For—" He gestured vaguely, a man trying to encompass something larger than words. "All of it." "Me too," she said. That was all that was said. It was enough. It was, she thought, exactly enough. It was August when Holt came to her. Not in the way she'd feared in the early months, not with the claim of marriage, not with the weight of obligation. He came to her in the evening on the porch while the summer dark settled over the valley and the fireflies that appeared some years did their brief work at the meadow's edge. "I've been thinking about the arrangement," he said. She waited. "You came here on my terms. My letter, my need, my—" He looked at the fireflies. "My failure to imagine that you were a whole person with your own needs." "Holt, let me say it." His jaw set, then released. "I've been watching you and Luke since the spring. I've been watching how you are with Sarah. I've been watching how you are when I'm not in the room and when you think nobody's watching and—" He stopped. And I think that I've been keeping something from happening that should happen. Out of, he paused, out of pride maybe, out of not wanting to admit what I see. She was very still. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't cost me something, he said. It does. It cost me something significant. He finally turned to look at her. His eyes were the winter sky color gray-blue and very clear. But I'm also not going to spend another winter being the thing that stands between my daughter and the complete family she deserves. Holt, I'm releasing you from the arrangement, he said. That's what I'm saying. Formally or however it needs to happen. You'll always have a place here. Sarah needs you here. And he stopped. I value you as a person, as a friend if you're willing. But you don't owe me what we agreed to. You never really did. She was quiet for a long time. The fireflies moved in the meadow grass. The mountains were black shapes against a dark blue sky. What about you, she said. What do you need? I need my daughter to be happy. I need my brother to stop walking around like he's apologizing to the air. And I need... For just a moment, something unguarded crossed his face. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not managing everything. She reached out and put her hand over his on the porch railing. Just for a moment. He looked down at it. You're going to be fine, she said. Maybe, he said. Probably. The ghost of the smile again, steadier this time. I have good help. She took her hand back. They stood on the porch for a while longer watching the fireflies, and when she finally said goodnight and went inside, she stood for a moment in the dark hallway with her hand on the wall, letting the realness of it settle through her. She found Luke at the flat rock by the east fence. She didn't know how she knew he'd be there, something she'd absorbed without cataloging his habits, his particular retreats. The evening was warm enough that she'd left her coat on the porch hook, and the trail up to the rock was dry and easy, and the valley below was caught in the last horizontal light of summer. He was sitting facing west, forearms on his knees, the position she'd first found him in the barn. He heard her coming and turned, and when he saw her, his whole face went still. She sat down beside him on the flat rock. They looked at the valley. The creek caught the light in long gold stretches. The shadows of the fence lines lay across the pasture in parallel bars. Holt talked to me this afternoon, he said. He talked to me tonight, she said. A pause. He asked me to stay, Luke said. He asked me to stay, and he stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. He said some things I didn't expect. He's been working up to them for a while. Emma. He turned to look at her. His eyes were very direct, the honest openness she'd known from the first morning in the barn all the way back in October, but stripped now of the careful distance they'd both maintained. What do you want? The question. The simplest possible question, and the hardest, because she had spent so long wanting things she couldn't have, and having things she hadn't wanted, and the space between those two facts was where most of the last year had lived. You, she said. One word, plain as anything. Something moved through his face, not surprise, not quite. Something more like the expression of a man who has been holding his breath for a long time and has just remembered how to exhale. Emma, he said. I know it's complicated, she said. I know there's the legal arrangement in Sarah and what Holt needs and what the ranch hands think, and he put his hand over hers on the rock. His palm was warm and calloused and very certain. Emma, he said again, just her name. She stopped talking. He was looking at her with all of himself visible, nothing managed or contained, and she thought about the long road from Wichita to this flat rock on a summer evening, the train and the letter and the ring and the blizzard and the night by Sarah's bedside, and the kitchen in the storm, and every conversation in every barn and kitchen and porch, and all of it had led here, and it was everything she hadn't planned and more than she'd imagined. I'm not going to be romantic about it, she said, because she was still at her core a practical woman from Kansas. I'm going to be honest. I love you. I think I've loved you since the barn that first week. I tried not to. I tried very hard not to. I know, he said. I know. I watched you try. His hand tightened on hers. I was trying too. We were both idiots. Spectacular idiots. The very best kind, she said. He laughed, the real laugh, the one that reached his eyes and changed the whole character of his face, and she laughed too, and for a moment they were simply two people laughing on a flat rock in the summer evening above a beautiful valley, and nothing else was complicated. Then he raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the old-fashioned gesture of it somehow exactly right, and she felt it through her whole body. "We'll figure out the rest," he said against her hand. "We will," she said. "We always do." The summer went on, the ranch went on. The complicated business of dissolving an arrangement that had never fully been a marriage legally sparse, practically unentangled because Holt had kept the promises he'd made, and Emma had kept hers, and neither had done more than was agreed, proved simpler than Emma had feared, and harder than she'd hoped in the ways that mattered, which had nothing to do with documents and everything to do with the daily texture of proximity. Holt was present in all of it with a grace that cost him something, and that she never stopped seeing the cost of. He was at breakfast, and he was on the porch, and he was in the yard, and he maintained the same careful, practical warmth he'd built through the winter and the spring. And some days that warmth had an edge of pain in it that she recognized and respected and didn't try to name. Sarah, told carefully and honestly by both her father and Emma, together on a Sunday morning in the parlor, had listened with her hands in her lap and her measuring child's eyes on each of them in turn. "Uncle Luke," she asked. "Yes," Emma said. Another silence, then directed at Holt. "Are you sad, Papa?" Holt looked at his daughter with the open, undefended face he had learned to show her over the last months. "Some," he said honestly, "but mostly I want you to be happy, and I want Emma to be happy, and—" He paused. "I want your Uncle Luke to stop looking like he's waiting for permission to exist." Sarah turned this over. "Is that going to happen?" "I think so," Holt said. "I think it's already starting." Sarah looked at Emma. Something in her expression was complicated and 10 years old, and also much older than that. "You're still staying," she said. It wasn't a question, but it needed confirmation. "I'm staying," Emma said. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home." The complicated look on Sarah's face simplified into something much more fundamental. Relief. Simple, bone-deep relief. She reached out and took Emma's hand and held it in her small fingers, and that was all the acceptance Emma needed. The wedding was in September, not in the judge's office this time, not a business transaction conducted above a hardware store with the minimum required witnesses. Emma had allowed Sarah to plan it because Sarah had been planning it in her imagination since approximately April, and the result was a ceremony in the home pasture on a Saturday afternoon when the aspens had started to turn and the mountains were the deepest green of late summer about to change. Sarah had decided on late afternoon because of the light. She had spent considerable time, more time than she'd spent on her arithmetic lessons all month, which Emma noted but let pass, thinking about where everyone should stand and what Emma should wear and whether there ought to be flowers, and concluded after extensive deliberation that the late afternoon light on the pasture was better than the morning light on account of the way it made everything look warm, and that Emma should wear her blue dress because it was the right color for the mountains, and that the flowers should be the dried bunch of mountain asters that hung in the kitchen because fresh flowers weren't available in September, and the dried ones were better anyway because they had history. Emma wore the blue dress and carried the dried asters and thought that Sarah had a future in event planning if medicine didn't call her. The entire ranch was there, the hands in their cleaned-up clothes Clarence in a shirt Emma hadn't seen before. Pete and Russ standing straight and fidgeting slightly. Two families from neighboring ranches whom she'd come to know through the summer came with their children. Old Doc Hartley from Ridgemont stood with his wife near the back. Holt stood at the front with Luke. She had worried about this, had tried to offer him a different position, in absence, anything that would reduce what she feared she was asking of him. He had declined all of it with the flat, simple directness that was she had learned his way of being genuine. "I'll stand with my brother," he said. "That's where I should be." So he stood there in the September afternoon with his hands at his sides and his winter sky eyes clear. And when Luke turned to watch Emma come up from the house, Sarah at her side, both of them in their best dresses, Sarah's braids perfectly, even for possibly the first time in her life. Holt's expression was the expression of a man who is feeling multiple true things at once and is no longer trying to resolve them into one. Emma walked toward the man she loved in the mountain valley that had become her home, past the faces of the people who had become her life, and the aspens trembled their papery sound in the September air, and the mountains were everything at once, purple and gray and green and enormous. Luke was watching her come with the open, whole expression she'd first cataloged in the barn and spent months trying not to love, and she walked toward it without looking away. The words were simple. Judge Pierce had come out from town, the same stout, silver-whiskered man with his practiced ceremonial ease, and the words were the same words that had been said on a Friday morning above a hardware store less than a year ago. But they were entirely different now because the world behind them was entirely different, built from a winter of truth-telling and a spring of reckoning and a summer of finding out who they all were without the structures they'd hidden inside. When the judge asked if Luke took this woman, Luke said yes without the measured pause that everything had required of everyone for so long. It came out of him like the truth. It was immediate, unguarded his. When the judge asked if Emma took this man, she looked at him, at his face, at the calloused hands that had always done the honest work of the ranch, at the eyes she'd been careful about for months and was now careful of in an entirely different way, and she said yes with the full weight of a woman who has earned her certainty. Holt Callahan, standing at his brother's side, kept his eyes forward. His jaw was set, his hands were steady. Sarah Blackwood, no longer Callahan in her heart of hearts, Emma thought, but something broader and more complicated than any single name, reached over and took her father's hand. He looked down at her. She smiled. His jaw softened. His face, so long held at careful distance from its own feeling, made a movement toward opening. He squeezed her hand. The judge said the final words, and Luke cupped Emma's face in both hands, the way no one had touched her in this year of practicality and arrangement, and he kissed her the way a man kisses when he has been honest about his feelings for months before he was allowed to act on them with everything in it. The waiting and the certainty and the gladness and the grief and the here and now reality of the mountain afternoon. The ranch hands cheered. Pete whistled. Clarence, who did not have a sentimental bone in his body and had been observed to stay dry-eyed through a funeral in the spring, turned briefly away and turned back again with his eyes very bright. Sarah let go of her father's hand and ran to Emma and threw her arms around her waist and held on with the strength of a girl who is month by month becoming less provisional in her hold on the world. Emma held her back. Over Sarah's head she could see Luke still watching her, and beyond him Holt, who was looking at his daughter with an expression she would carry in her chest for the rest of her life. A man coming back to himself slowly, the way spring comes to high country. Not suddenly, not all at once, but unmistakably, inevitably, as if it was always going to happen, given enough time and enough warmth. That winter was mild. Not by Kansas standards. There were storms, in the deep cold, in the particular stillness of heavy snowfall, but mild by the standards of the mountain valley, which meant that the worst weeks were manageable and the good weeks were genuinely beautiful. And Sarah got through the whole season without a single night that required a bedside vigil. On a Thursday morning in December, Emma was in the kitchen garden, dormant now. Snow covered the stakes and canes, making a bare architecture above the white, when she heard running feet and turned to find Sarah crossing the yard at full tilt in her boots and coat, her braids flying, her face absolutely lit. "Emma, come look." "What is it?" "The mountain's come now before it goes." Emma put down her trowel and went following Sarah's tug on her hand around the side of the house to the long view of the eastern ridge, and there it was, the fresh snowfall of the night before, and the low winter sun hitting the peaks at exactly the right angle, and the entire ridge lit the impossible, improbable pink that she'd been promised on her very first morning here. "I see it," Emma said. Sarah turned to her with the expression that had changed so much over the year. No longer desperate hope, no longer the wait to see if someone would stay. Just joy, plain and generous, and freely given. "Every time," she said, with the conviction of someone sharing a personal theology. "Every time it does that." Emma put her arm around the girl's thin shoulders and pulled her in, and they stood together watching the mountains turn from pink to pearl to gray, and behind them the house sat solid in the snow, with smoke rising from all three chimneys, and from the barn came the sounds of morning work, voices and the sound of horses, and Luke's laugh at something one of the hands had said. After a moment, the back door opened and Holt came out with 2 cups of coffee. He crossed the yard and handed one to Emma without being asked, and stood beside her. "I saw you run," he said to Sarah. "The mountains," Sarah said, as if that explained everything. "They do that," he said. "They've been doing it as long as I can remember." He looked at the peaks, which were fully gray now, the pink having done its brief work, and moved on. They stood there together, the three of them, in the cold December morning. The man who had learned to open, the child who had learned to run. The woman who had learned that the life you build from necessity can be more real than the one you planned, and the mountain valley held them in its massive, indifferent, specific, and irreplaceable beauty. Luke came out of the barn. He saw them and walked across the yard and stopped beside Emma, and she leaned into him slightly, just slightly, the small gravity of the utterly familiar, and he put his arm around her without looking down. "Did you see it?" Sarah demanded. "From the barn," he said. "We all saw it. It's better from here." "It always is," he said. The 5 chimneys smoked. The creek said its winter things under the ice. The mountains simply were the way they always were, the way they would be long after all of this. The arrangements and the grief and the guilt and the love and the careful daily work of building something true had gone back into the ground from which it came. Sarah Callahan said, "Come on, I'm cold," and turned toward the house, and they all followed her, which was how it had always been, which was how it should be. They went inside. The door closed behind them. The mountains stayed pink a little longer in Emma's memory than they had in the actual sky. But that was all right. Some things deserve to last longer than they do.